All right, let's talk about NATO training Ukrainian forces, the pros, the cons, what they're missing, and what they can do better going forward. There was a great thread just came out on Twitter that I'll link in the description below by Konstantin, who fought with Ukrainian forces back in 2014-15 timeframe, I believe, and is now in the United States. And he interacted with a handful of Ukrainian soldiers to get this feedback. You know, it's guys that went through NATO training. I believe in Germany is the example here, or the people he spoke with, moved back into Ukraine, into the fight, and have since been engaged in combat operations with Russian forces. So, you know, they're able to say what worked. What did we learn that we were able to successfully utilize in the battlefield? What did we not learn that cost us lives? That kind of thing. Now, I do think, just reading through the comments on Twitter, I think that this, you know, the lessons learned from this aren't necessarily what I think they should be, and it's something I'm going to get into here. So, early on, Konstantin says that you cannot expect Western militaries to be perfectly in tune with the requirements of the Ukrainian battlefield at the institutional level when our own institutions run into smaller problems with less distance to the front. That is not something unique to this war. That is war. That is war throughout history. If you go back and look at any major conflict, I mean, there's countless examples through World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, even my experience in Afghanistan. What you learn stateside, I'll say in this example, away from the front, out of country, kind of the pre-war train up, if you will, is going to be different than what the actual immediate TTPs are at the front. So there's a great example in Band of Brothers. It's the Market Garden episode, I believe, where they're getting ready to jump into Holland. And I think it's Sergeant Compton, where I think that's who it is. I'll double check, but he's talking to his new soldiers, these replacements that just came in, and Compton's been through a bunch of fights already. He's a battle-hardened veteran, and these guys are trying to strap in their parachutes and all their kit, and Compton walks over and takes their weapon out of the protective covering and says, if you want to live, jump ready to fight. That's something where those soldiers would have learned that in their basic training, their airborne training, AIT, whatever it was, even their last minute of training heading out the door to the European theater of operations. But when they actually get into the fight, they have to lean on those combat veterans that are in that battle space, in that AO, to tell them, I got it. That was the way we did it there. If you want to survive here, this is how it needs to be done. So keep that in mind as we're moving through this, because that concept of rear elements not being perfectly up to date, I think ends up being one of the incorrect lessons learned here. That was always going to be the case. So continuing, Konstantin says he's spoken with one of the sergeants, call sign Nestor, Nestor, about the training they received. He said it included basic infantry, reconnaissance, and assault tactics, and the verdict was mixed. Nestor said it was like the instructors were in a vacuum. We received training in infantry tactics, while this is a war of artillery and drones. Now, it's kind of a mixed bag, because you can't expect the rear elements to be perfectly in tune with what's happening in the front, but we also can't be so far off that you're actually training things that are detrimental, right? So an example here, there are still infantry tactics being utilized throughout this war. The primary means of the fight right now really are taking place with artillery and drones. I got it, but any one of these fights, you are still seeing infantry elements move up and through to occupy position. So it's not irrelevant. Continuing on, Nestor said that his commander at one point asked one of the NATO trainers if they could at least consider the presence of drones on the battlefield, and the answer was no. He said, quote, you didn't bring your drones with you, and the only drones we have available are the DJI Phantom 4, and we can't use it for bureaucratic reasons. All right, so that's probably swinging a little too far in the other direction. Right? I mean, nobody should be surprised at all that drones are being heavily used at all times, all across the battlefield. I could understand the argument if it was, spending hours, days, or weeks training on one specific type of drone system. Because what if you spend all that time on one thing and then these Ukrainian soldiers get into country and that's not what they have at their disposal? It'd be time wasted to a degree. But ignoring that drones are over the battlefield at all, that's a problem. Hopefully that is a one-off experience and not something permeating throughout some of the NATO training programs. They continue saying our battalion received 0 defensive combat training. It was all assault-oriented. Adding the infantry didn't learn how to conceal positions, build bunkers, and there was no defensive combat training. Now, one thing to add here is when this training was being done was in preparation for what everybody believed was a coming Ukrainian counteroffensive, offensive, however you want to call it. So with a limited period of time able to get that training complete, it's not crazy that the majority of the time was spent on offensive type operations. It's just it takes so many more reps, so much more practice, so much more coordination to successfully pull off any sort of offensive operation. I can understand that 90+% of the time would want to be geared in that direction. Now, again, another aspect here, if there was zero, at least limited defensive combat training in terms of setting up a hasty fighting position or digging a trench, anything, like that's a problem if that was at zero. Hopefully there was at least just a little bit on the defensive side, but not crazy that the majority was focused on the offensive. On a positive note, the sergeant says is that our infantry learned to move and storm buildings and trenches. If you consider this basic infantry training, it was good. The infantry company spent 7 days practicing assault combined operations, storming different objectives. One day was a small town, another day was an enemy trench. We went through swamps, mud, and cold nights. Once, our instructor said that living through it on the battlefield would be easier if we experienced these conditions now. He was right. So I like that, right? I mean, think about, again, what these forces were largely being trained for was an offensive operation through urban and rural terrain. So good. I like it. They do say that one of the things that was needed that was not conducted was EOD training and awareness. Nestor, the sergeant here, says, you must understand the battlefield is littered with booby traps, mines, and explosive ordnance. We knew it before the deployment. Everyone in Ukraine knows it now. We asked trainers if we could get any training on the topic, but for some reason, the trainers refused to even discuss it. Again, with a lot of these, you have to keep in mind you're getting one person's perception of how it played out. So again, hopefully it's not that the trainers refused to even discuss booby traps, and it was at least in the conversation. Because again, it's no secret that all of Ukraine, or all along the front, is just littered with mines and booby traps at this point. One thing that comes to mind for me here is just a legacy of how we've conducted EOD-type operations in the United States, at least for a long period of time. We train our EOD personnel for years. They go through so much, intensive training to get to the point where they can confidently disassemble mines and IEDs and whatever else it might be on the battlefield. Then we've also got combat engineers, our sappers, who also go through a ton of training specific to, how to disassemble this type of UXO on the battlefield where they don't blow themselves and everyone else up. And there is this buffer there where you want people trained enough to be able to identify it, but not enough to where they feel confident but don't actually have the skill set of dealing with the thing, right? So there's this big gap between I understand what, how to identify a mine or a tripwire or whatever it is, but then there's this huge learning curve until you get to the point of being able to successfully mitigate that threat in a combat environment. And for us, the way we've been able to do that in the United States is we have sappers and EOD that are on that end of the spectrum that we can call to resolve the problem. I wonder if this is a little bit of a legacy of that. We're looking at it through our lens. We don't really want to train the infantrymen in how to disassemble IEDs because they're probably just going to get themselves blown up, unfortunately, right? Wait for the experts to come in. It feels like that might be what's seeping in here. Continuing on, there is a story from a soldier in another unit who came across some of these newly NATO-trained troops. And he said, quote, we were driving 15 kilometers from the front line, and I noticed a military truck with a full platoon clustered around near one of the small local grocery stores. They acted like they didn't know it was a war zone. We had to stop and tell them that Russian drones were reported around. The platoon commander did not know the enemy had such capabilities. There's something in the United States that we do called RSOI, Reception, Staging, and Onward Integration, and it's kind of the transition, if you will, into a theater of operations. And that's what comes to mind when I see this. Like, I find it hard to believe that Ukrainian soldiers wouldn't know when they're in the trenches under shell fire that Russian drones are around. But there is a point in the country where you don't have to worry about drones striking you or loitering munitions hitting your position 24/7, right? The further west you get in the country, the less likely that actually is to happen. So to me, that's a little bit of something that NATO could help with for sure, but explaining this process of, once these guys cross a line or leave their last staging point, you got to get that brief of, hey, from here forward, you can't bunch up. From here forward, you are in range of Russian loitering munitions. So something to think about. I don't know that that's necessarily a shortcoming of NATO training, but definitely something NATO could help with in terms of how these troops move forward into the actual fight. They talked about something here that felt a little bit off. I'm going to bring it up, but it didn't ring true with what I've experienced in the past. They said a grave mistake in NATO training was that a company commander stayed in the trenches with the company. They said, try sitting under tank shelling and yelling over the radio while being yelled over the radio yourself. It's much more efficient when the company commander has his own command and control room with drone streams coming in. He can make calm and weighted decisions looking at the battlefield instead of listening to what is happening, and is no longer a game of telephone. Now, you get the two sides of the argument here where there is a value as a leader, especially in the military, to put yourself in a place where you're asking, a place of risk, where you're asking your people to go carry out those operations. And there is value in plenty of occasions of leading from the front and being there with your men or women. But when you're talking about commanding a large organization, even if it's 20, 30, 40, up into the hundreds, you need to be set back just a little bit to where you can understand the bigger picture. And that's not new. We rarely, I don't think I've ever been in an organization where the company commander is at the very front, kicking in the door time and time again, or in this case, in the first trench line. Like, that's not where the company commander would be. So it's a little bit surprising to hear that was somehow relayed as part of NATO training, that the commander or some of the leaders in the organization need to be at the forwardmost position. That doesn't jive with my training or what I've experienced. So I don't know. That one caught me a little bit off guard. Continuing on, they said that another capability that was undertrained might surprise people, and it's driving. Drivers have to be more experienced in driving at night. Driving during the day is just too dangerous. That's a simple one. It's kind of boring. I feel like that's in the same category as logistics. Nobody wants to talk about logistics, but it's what keeps every army in the fight. I'm sure when Ukrainian forces took off to go do their training in these different NATO countries, they weren't looking forward to the long stretches of night vision driver's training. It's just not that exciting. But it makes sense that that's something that needs to be prioritized going forward. Good news, that is also something that can be trained in Ukraine, right? There's no reason you couldn't do this same type of exercise in portions of Ukraine a little bit further from the front, especially in the western parts of the country. You could easily set up driving courses, throw some night vision devices on, and get those drivers additional training for a week or two before you kick them out to the front. So that's not a showstopper. That can be resolved. Now, Konstantin wraps up here with what I think is probably the best takeaway, and I really enjoyed this piece. I'm worried that a lot of people didn't get to the bottom here. He says, Ukraine needs to treat NATO training as basic infantry training instead of a complete cycle of brigade battalion level preparation. We need to perform post-training exercise and adapt the units to the newest technologies and tactics on the battlefield. And I 100% agree. You've got these, I think maybe there was the perception that these units would go off of newly mobilized soldiers, newly recruited soldiers from Ukraine would go off to these NATO training grounds and come back, these hardened warriors with all of the skills and expertise. And I don't think anybody realistically expected that, right? But so there's a process that we have to go through here. And those NATO training grounds are never going to be exactly up to date with what the soldiers are experiencing at the front. There needs to be some degree of basic training, basic rifle marksmanship, medical, all of that kind of stuff. That can happen. And maybe that's the place for NATO in this war, right? But when you're talking about how to avoid getting a grenade dropped on you from a drone when you're in a frontline trench, I don't want to learn that from some NATO soldier in Germany. If my life depends on it, want to hear it from someone in Ukraine who's dealt with it for months on end. When you're talking about how to target certain Russian positions in this war, the person to ask is not a NATO soldier in the United States or elsewhere. It's the Ukrainians that have been doing it time and time again. So I like where he went with this. I think that's probably how to view this in the future. NATO as some sort of basic infantry training or basic artillery training, probably expand that out to a few others. And then as you transition into country, as you transition into the active war zone, you might get a little more specialized training in around some regional training centers, maybe in Lviv or Kyiv. And then as you move out to the front and you start to integrate with your unit, some sort of transition. I'm sure that's happening, right? At the lowest level, you've got soldiers explaining to the new guys when they come in, here's what you actually need to do in order to stay alive. But overall, I think it was a great piece. I'm really glad Konstantin put this together. It's some of the best feedback I've seen so far in terms of NATO training in Ukraine. Again, the link to his thread and his profile will be in the description below if you want to check it out. And of course, if you're interested in any sort of national security subjects, be sure to check out the sit reps I put out on Substack. That also is in the description below. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.